Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this side event on how to build green and inclusive economies to implement the Paris Agreement. The event is jointly hosted by the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, a collaboration of UN Environment, the UN Development Programme, the International Labour Organization, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, and the UN Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR. And the event is jointly hosted together with the World Trade Organization and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Let me also take the opportunity to thank our funding partners for their support over the past years, including the European Commission, the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Building and Nuclear Safety, Germany, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment, the Ministry of Environment of the Republic of Korea, the government of Sweden, and the Swiss Confederation, the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of some of our partner countries here, including Mongolia. I think we have a representative over here. Peru, somebody in the room. Senegal. I think I saw some colleagues over here.
Well, we've got Cheickh, the representative.
Okay, wonderful. Ghana, anybody? Thank you, Emmanuel. Mauritius, Burkina Faso, from China, Jiangsu province, South Africa, Barbados, Brazil, Mato Grosso state, Cheick's Republic, Uruguay and Guyana just joined the partnership this year. So with this, I have the pleasure to now introduce our first speaker, Mr. Stephan Contius, Commissioner for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, Head of Division at the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Building and Nuclear Safety from Germany. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is my honor to welcome you on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for the Environment to this side event, which is hosted by PAGE, the WTO and UNITAR, and which will give us the opportunity to discuss the role of economic and financial policies for the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda. With the adoption of these two agreements, 2015 has been a quite historic year for multilateral cooperation. The two milestone documents and their respective set of goals have laid the foundation for the transformation towards climate-resilient, sustainable growth, and not to forget, for more solidarity worldwide. Even though both agreements have their own targets, the implementation processes and rules are, of course, separate. It is clear that these two milestone documents have the potential to significantly reinforce each other and to create the much-needed momentum for a transition towards more sustainability. Now, after the goals themselves have been agreed upon, the next big task is their ambitious implementation. The COP here in Bonn represents a very important step towards the operationalization of the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions for climate change. In this regard, an important factor that will determine whether we will be able to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius or even 1.5 degrees Celsius are the economic and financial policies that countries will put in place over the next 5 to 10 years. Therefore, implementing the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda is not just a matter for environment or development policies. It is a task for the whole of society. For a successful global transformation towards sustainable and climate-friendly development, we will need to work together. with all stakeholders from national and global governments, governmental areas, from civil society, from industry, and from trade unions. Today, around 2 years after the adoption of the 2030 Agenda and of the Paris Agreement, we are seeing an emergence of sustainable and inclusive growth models, which are already demonstrating that our shared global values of inclusivity and environmental sustainability are within reach and will also pay off economic-wise for society as a whole in case we really start now and find good compromises with the actors involved. This is also the conclusion of a recent OECD study which Germany commissioned during its G20 presidency. According to the OECD's analysis, ambitious climate action, if combined with climate-compatible growth policies, can serve as an efficient modernization program for our economies with positive effects for sustainable development, innovation, employment, social inclusion, and, very important, political stability. There are enormous challenges ahead of us. If you look into the policy areas, for instance, of agriculture and transport, it's very visible how much we have to work to achieve the transformation or transition to more sustainable forms of practices. We also have to acknowledge that the envisaged structural transformation towards more sustainability might cause certain social and economic disruptions in the short term. For example, with jobs moving from one sector to another. In this regard, it will be our task as governments to integrate those social and economic implications by far more effectively into our policies and to make sure that the needed transformation will be in line with the guiding principle of the 2030 Agenda, to leave no one behind. This is also the background behind the Partnership for Action page. During the last 5 years, PAGE has supported interested countries in a unique and very efficient way in reframing their economic policies and practices around sustainability to foster economic growth, create jobs, and reduce poverty and inequality. Beyond the bilateral work, the partnership is aiming to drive and inspire a global movement towards inclusive, sustainable growth. A notable example for the ability of PAGE to bring together stakeholders from all fronts of society was the PAGE Ministerial in Berlin this March, with more than 430 participants from around 45 countries, including ministers and state secretaries of very different sectors: labor, environment, energy, economy and industry, and finance. As other events organized by PAGE during the last years, the Berlin Ministerial has shown that issues are simply too complex and the world too interconnected for acting separately within the confines of small gated communities of practice. At the heart of the 2030 Agenda and also of the Paris Agreement, we must create and build trust and a shared sense of purpose for better action. That's why Germany, alongside the European Commission, Finland, South Korea, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, is investing in PAGE as a vehicle for transformative change, and we will continue to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephan, for these inspiring remarks. One of the first countries to join PAGE in 2013 was Mongolia. And since then, the country has put in place quite a remarkable policy framework for green and sustainable development. And we would like to show you a short video that illustrates a little bit how this looks like in practice.
economy assessments that are done under PAGE are tremendously useful, particularly when a country is embarking on an exercise which looks at their development pathway. What they enable policymakers to do is to visualize the future, visualize the impact of their decisions before the decision is taken.
I believe that green economy is actually inherited in our culture, traditions, and lifestyle. That's why green economy concepts are so close to our heart and mindset. I believe that people are aware about the need for green economy development in Mongolia, and this is the very right time for Mongolians to take this development pathway.
Mongolia has developed dramatically in the last 2 decades, but the economic side has excelled compared to its social and environmental developments. Around 4 years ago, in 2013, all commercial banks of Mongolia have made a decision to start greening their finance activities. So since the commercial banking sector makes up 96% of the entire financial system, the bank's collective movement towards sustainable development is a very important step.
Банк санхүүгийн үйл ажиллагаан дээр бид ногоон зээлийн санг бий болох ажлыг бол нэлээд идэвхжүүлж байгаа. Түншлэлийн хүрээнд доктортой хөгжил, ногоон эдийн засгийн эрх зүй, шинжилгээний бодлого, олон төрлийн судалгаанууд хийгдэж байгаа. Хүний нөөцийг чадваржуулж байгаа. Түр хувийн хвшил, иргэний нийгмийн түншлэлийг бэхжүүлж байгаа.
Mongolian government has put a goal by the end of 2020. At least 20% of the public procurement should be green, all green.
PAGE is trying to basically look at aspects such as what happens if we invest a certain percent of GDP into green development. What happens to the growth trajectories?
Хүүхэд сурах орчныг ногоон байлгах чиглэлээр PAGE-с хэрэгжүүлж байгаа төсөл хөтөлбөрийн хүрээнд бол зураг төсвийг боловсруулаад анх Азийн хөгжлийн банкнаас хэрэгжүүлэх гэж байгаа төсөлд хамруулахар болсон.
The Green School Design Project has inspired us to change the way we do the business and step up to a higher level of innovation. We have introduced many green technological solutions including energy, water, materials and waste management.
We believe that next generations needs to be informed and have the skills and implement principles of green economy. PAGE is working with National University of Mongolia on integrating green economy and concept and approach into university programs and curricula with a special focus on green economy, modeling and sustainable finance.
So as you can see, when we filmed the video, it was even colder in Mongolia than here in Bonn. I hope this gives you an idea what has happened in Mongolia over the past years, from the policy framework to then also action at sector level, but also involving universities and other partners. We'll hear a little bit more about Mongolia in just a moment, but let me first introduce you to our distinguished panelists. Dr. Batjargal, a special envoy for climate change from Mongolia. If you want to join me here on the panel, thank you. Mrs. Rhoda Boateng, program coordinator from the International Trade Union Confederation. Welcome. Mr. Philipp Ischer, program manager from the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. Welcome. Thanks for joining. Mr. Ho Lim, director, Trade and Environment Division from the World Trade Organization. Thank you. And Ms. Regina Asariotis, Chief Policy and Legal Legislation Section from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Thank you, Regina, for being here today. And also, of course, our moderator, Mr. Kamal Geye, from the coordinator of the Green Jobs Program at the International Labour Organization.
Thank you very much, Ambre. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at this session of the Climate Conference with the Partnership for Action on the Green Economy. I would like to first start by asking you to warmly welcome our panel members. Just a round of applause so that we get started on a good note. I just wanted to mention also before we begin that today is the Youth Day at the COP. We have 1.2 billion young people aged from 15 to 24 among ourselves. So I'd like to ask for a round of applause for the young people that will be the generations that will carry forward this agenda. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. We have just heard from Mongolia, the first page country where this program has been operating. And I just would like to start with Dr. Batjargal for you to just tell us a little more since Mongolia adopted a green development policy in 2014 and an implementation strategy for it in 2016. What has happened on the policy front, and what are the initiatives you are taking to advance this agenda? Doctor, please.
Good morning or good afternoon already. First of all, I would like to express my thanks to organizer of this event that they show video, which makes it very easy for me to say something about green development in Mongolia. Actually, Mongolia is what the was first country to join the page, but in fact, Mongolia is a foreign country by willings, not by action, I should tell. And also, people are asking why you are talking about green development, while the rest of the world is talking about green economy, green growth, and so on. And there is some reason why. But first of all, I should tell that green development policy or concept is not something special one or not something very ambitious than green economy. It is why we decided to develop green development policy. I was a member of the team of development of this policy, and we decided we cannot go very fast and even in front of many countries, but we have to mobilize some internal resources, including traditional way of life, and what people in Mongolia enjoyed and tasted throughout hundreds of years. In the past, society in Mongolia was fully free waste society and fully recycling society, and they could provide basic human needs and not experiencing difficulties despite the harsh climate condition or natural hazards and so on, even different kind of disease and so on. And they haven't any support from the outside, no any UN agency support, no any special donor support and so on. They could survive and even to some extent to prosper. And it means, but today we have everything, but why we cannot, for example, to reach target, even very modest targets, including Paris Agreement and so on. And therefore we decide that we have to mobilize not only modern technology, modern know-how, but we have to mobilize something from our past. And therefore the concept of green development was developed. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for this first introduction. I think the way you frame it, looking at history and why, despite the development that has been achieved, some of the objectives of sustainability are still challenging. I think we will have a time to come back to that. But please allow me now to turn to Ms. Rhoda Boateng. One of the promises that we have heard from the keynote address by Mr. Stephan Contius is that we see a promise of job creation in the transition towards green economies, but it is also known that there are challenges, that the structural transformations could mean job losses, job displacement at the same time, and workers' organizations are at the center of this concern. So could you tell us, how do you see this agenda from a workers' organization point of view?
Right, thank you very much, Kamal, and thank you very much to Paige for putting this together, organizing this, and specifically inviting trade unions, because this is what we are pushing for. For us, it's important that we are brought to the table at the very onset of discussions, and so we are very happy that we are included in these discussions. Yes, we see that it's known that climate change definitely is going to negatively have negative effects and impact on jobs. But then at the same time, we know that this is actually also going to create opportunities for job creation in different sectors. And the ILO stipulates that there's a potential of over 60 million jobs to be created in new and emerging sectors. And so as much as we are concerned about jobs that would be affected in the process, we are at the same time happy about the potential jobs that can be created. But at the same time, we also know that these jobs will not just happen. We need the right policies in place to ensure that these jobs are decent and not just any jobs. And also these jobs are created in sectors where we know are most vulnerable. Studies have shown that jobs are going to be transformed in different ways. There's going to be substitution of jobs in sectors such as the waste industry, where jobs would be transformed to recycling, etc. There's also going to be transformation of jobs. But we are saying, for us as trade unions, and representatives of workers, the approach and model that we are trying to push forward is to ensure that this process to transition is done in a very in a way that takes on board the concerns of workers and the rights of workers. And it's for this reason that we have established the rule of the rights of workers to know. We are pushing that transition should take on board a social dialogue process where you have employers represented at the table, you have workers on board, as well as policymakers. And this is at the heart of our discussion. And this actually forms the basis of just transition, which we are strongly advocating for.
Thank you very much, Rhoda. I think we will come back to that. And given what we said in the beginning, that this is also the youth day in the COP, and when people refer to the demographic dividend, there's a lot of focus on issues in the African continent. And since you're coming from ITUC-Africa, I would like to come back to you maybe in the second round to hear, what does it mean for youth and the demographic dividend in Africa. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll just come back in the next round for an interactive exchange with all of you. But before that, just please allow me to turn to Mr. Philipp Ischer. Philipp, over the past years, Switzerland, alongside Germany, the European Commission, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and South Korea, have made significant investment in the PAGE partnership. So could you tell us why do you see value in supporting this joint program, and what do you expect it to deliver? Mr. Stephan, please.
Yeah, thank you, Kamal. Good day to everyone. Green economy is at the heart of the current framework credit of the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. The overarching goals of our strategy and our intervention is the stimulation creation of sustainable and inclusive growth in developing countries. But green economy is not only high on the agenda of the strategy of the Swiss international cooperation, but also of big importance for the national political domain. So Switzerland possesses, like many other countries here, a green economy roadmap, which consists of 3 different parts or work streams. One is on consumption and production, other one is on waste and raw material, and the third is on instruments. And international cooperation belongs now to the instrument part. So now is the question, what is actually the rationale behind the fact that the international cooperation is then part of a national green economy roadmap? Actually it's quite simple. Switzerland, as a small and open economy with more or less no heavy industry and no natural resources, is importing quite a huge amount of grey energy and raw materials. So, and with other words, if our intervention now from the side of international contribution contributes to the greening of the economy of developing countries, we, at least indirectly, make also our own value chain more sustainable. This is, I think, a good example why green economy or sustainability are topics that are of importance for all countries. So, but now why exactly PAGE? PAGE offers to us the opportunity to support developing countries on their endeavor towards green economy together. And thanks to the convening power of the 5 UN agencies, PAGE is well positioned in our view for its upstream interventions. This means helping countries develop their own green strategy, for example. PAGE provides policy makers with technical advice, analysis, research, which is necessary to make information-based decisions. Therefore, PAGE can facilitate the decision-making process and help countries to move forward on their way to green their own economy.
Well, thank you very much, Philipp. I think there's a very clear understanding of the role of international cooperation. I think the whole effort which is taking place here at the COP in Bonn is about international cooperation. And in that context, I think one of the efforts that the PAGE agencies are doing, and which our member countries have recognized, is the need for the United Nations system to build more synergy, to deliver more effectively, and to make whatever we do mean something to people. And I think we very much appreciate this recognition of PAGE funding partners, and so we'll come back to change further on that. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like just to now turn to trade. trade plays an important dimension in the transition towards the greener economies, and we are very fortunate to have senior officials from the World Trade Organization and UNCTAD with that. I just would like to start with Director Holim. The global system of trade largely depend on transport and maritime transport, but there's value chains as well. But developing countries have specific concerns about green protectionism in this context. So what conditions do you see as being needed in both developing and developed countries to take advantage of green trade opportunities?
Thanks very much, Kamal. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks as well to Page Partners for putting together this initiative, which is certainly very timely and important. I think my first starting point, maybe to pick up a little bit on what Mr. Contius said in his remarks, that we live in an interconnected world, and that world is becoming increasingly interconnected. I have 2 teenage children, and they remind me continuously how interconnected it is. Simply the way they do homework today was completely different from the way I used to do homework. They actually connect with their friends via Skype. They see problems actually on the screen, and they discuss through the internet. They even source their lessons through the internet. Virtually everything they use, and many of you have these instruments, from iPhones to laptops to anything else, is not made in one single country. It's made globally. And that's really the essence of the value chain. Global value chain basically means that, today everything that we consume, produce, is in some way or other interconnected. That brings opportunities, and opportunities for sustainable transition, but it also, of course, has challenges. And you point to one of the challenges, which is concerns of whether all countries can equally participate in such a transition. Now, as the beginning of the conversation, I just make some 3 very basic points. I think, how do we deal with this problem or potential problem of protectionism? I think the first thing is simply to say that the WTO framework, the World Trade Organization framework, is precisely designed to deal with protectionism. Not just necessarily green protectionism, but any type of protectionism. So one condition would be simply to abide by the rules of the WTO agreements. Some of these rules are essentially quite basic. It's basically about non-discrimination, which comes to your point about dealing with inequalities, providing equal opportunity, essentially. Another important part of the rules is actually about transparency. If you have more transparency in terms of measures that are being adopted, the hope is that that transparency will help foster a dialogue that could eventually lead to minimizing trade frictions. But I think protectionism, at least in the WTO context, is a very particular word. I mean, it means when a country actually designs and takes on board particular type of measures with the intent of blocking out other countries. So that's very much the protectionism idea or concept in WTO, and I would say for the most part that can be dealt with through abidance to WTO rules. WTO rules do, of course, also have within them general exceptions in recognition of the need to pursue environmental objectives, health objectives, and other public policy objectives. And that balance between exceptions and observance of rules is something well established in the system. I think a bigger challenge, and I wouldn't call this protectionism, but I think it is something that would fit into what you were saying about why some developing countries, or many, feel a bit hesitant, is that as society and economy requires more requirements, requires more standards, for instance, it raises the question of supply-side capacity. Can they actually meet these requirements? And with that, the question of quality infrastructure. Today, to export any of the things that I talked about, from iPhones to laptops to clothes, for instance, you need to have a good quality infrastructure. This is not necessarily about protectionism, but it's about the ability to actually meet that requirement and to join that transition. So it's a very different set of issues. So those were just some few opening remarks on being a bit clearer on what we understand and mean by protectionism. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Lim, for pointing to the important role that the WTO framework and the multilateral trading regime can play in this context to prevent protectionism, but also the opportunities. I'd like to come maybe in the second round on where opportunities are and how they could be seized. But I think what you said about the supply side challenges is an excellent transition to our next panelist, Ms. Regina Asariotis, who is Chief of Legislation section at UNCTAD. So Regina, UNCTAD has been focusing on climate adaptation and resilience, building for seaports and all the transport infrastructure. And we understand these are important to bridge the issues of supply side that we've just heard from Director Lim. So can you please share some of the insights that you have gained as part of your work and explain to us particularly what connects it to the climate change regime?
Thank you very much, Kamal. And good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for your time and for your interest, because there are many things to choose from, and you chose to come here. What we've been working on is a slightly different angle from what you've heard so far. UNCTAD is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development within the UN system, the focal point for consideration of trade and development issues. And as such, our focus is very much on global trade. And global trade needs to be transported. So however digital everything is, and e-commerce is very big, of course, and getting bigger, but you still need to transport everything, and it all depends on transportation, which is one of the reasons why we work on this sectoral issue. Now, in the field of transportation, interconnection, again, is something which is all prevalent. So 60% of goods globally are loaded and unloaded in developing countries, and 80% of all goods traded are carried by sea. So you can see we're all, as it were, in the same boat. And now to come to the point about climate. In relation to climate change, the focus of the discussion in most sectors tends to be on the mitigation side, which is very important. But at the same time, there is the flip side of the coin, namely to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And it's very, once one starts thinking about it, it's very obvious that in transportation, key transport infrastructure, such as ports, but of course this goes across the supply chain, it's very important to make sure these are climate resilient. So this is what we've been focusing on since 2008 with a series of expert meetings, research, etc. And we are engaged also in an ongoing technical assistance program with focus on small island developing states in the Caribbean. In terms of where this links in, I have already said a few words on this, but what did we learn from our work? So if you don't have efficient transportation, or to put it differently, apart from clear damage that could arise as a result from increased climate variability and change, and from certain climatic factors, certainly at the coast, it's obvious sea level rise, increased extreme weather events. Apart from that, you can also have climate-related disruption and delay to transportation throughout the supply chain. Could be a measly little bridge, which is not in working condition and disrupting trade between two countries. So it's very important to have added and additional awareness of this. Certainly what we did learn was that much more interdisciplinary work is necessary, and because the impacts do depend very much on the sector, the location, etc. It's very important to have targeted vulnerability and risk and vulnerability studies to develop adequate adaptation options. There are specific problems which arise for small island developing states, and time permitting, I'd like to come back to that if there an opportunity arises. But all this to say, and I hope if I just with 5 minutes give you something to think about, it's very important that we all collectively pay attention to preparing for the impacts of climate change, because if we wait for the effects to hit, we've seen this now in the Caribbean with the hurricanes, but we've seen this with Hurricane Sandy, for instance, in New York, the economic knock-on effects are massive, and we should certainly do what we can to avoid these. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Regina. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have heard from the opening remarks of Mr. Stephan Contius why the climate agenda and the 2030 agenda are connected and possible strong guiding frameworks for the transition towards a green economies. We have heard what could be done from the perspective of a national development planning, a green development strategy in the case of Mongolia. We have heard about employment and social inclusion dimensions and what challenges and opportunities this presents for workers. We have heard about the important role that international cooperation can play where development partners work together with countries and UN system helping in that process. We have heard about trade, the opportunities, but also some of the risks of trade protectionism and the issues of resilience of infrastructure that enables trade to happen. So with that, I just would like to invite you to join us now in an interactive dialogue. Please raise any questions that you would like our distinguished panelists to elaborate further, any contribution, comments, or other suggestions. But I just wanted to ask if anybody from the UAE is here. We know we had a delegate from the UAE or Sweden, our funding partners. So and Mr. Contius also please feel free to join us in the discussion at any point. But let me just first maybe open the floor. I see Madame there. Madame, would you like to have a reaction at this point?
She's from Sweden. I only wanted to acknowledge that I'm from the Swedish delegation, so I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madame, I see Madame there and then the gentleman in front. May I just invite you to please introduce yourself, and if you want to direct a question to individual panel, to do that, or to any of our panelists.
My name is Claudia. I'm from Brazil, working for the network in transition cities. I would like to know if you think about also in small scale, in local business, how to begin greener, or only in more large scale, like in between countries, but do you think also inside of the countries? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marcus Fischer. I'm currently with the UN Environment Finance Initiative, and as you can hopefully see, also a young individual, as today is the day for the youth. So the young people, we will not only be hit hardest by climate change, but we will also be fully experiencing what you've already mentioned, the fourth industrial revolution, so to speak, so all the technological changes. Maybe if I can just briefly give you an example also how this is linked to climate change and green development. So just 10 years ago in 2007, the three largest companies by market capitalization were China Petroleum, General Electric, and ExxonMobil. So you can see very fossil fuel heavy. And nowadays we have Apple, we have Amazon, and Microsoft. So there was just in 10 years within the market capitalization, within the financial markets, a large shift towards more tech. So my question now would be within green economy, how can we leverage this fourth industrial revolution, features such as artificial intelligence or blockchain? How can we capitalize on that for green economy development through, for example, trade or through labor? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other comment or reaction at this point? Yes, sir, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Emmanuel from Ghana. The issue of recycling, consumption and production, and use of instruments in relation to green jobs was mentioned. And I would like that more light is thrown on the issue of using instruments for green jobs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think these are very, very interesting questions, the role and opportunities for small businesses within countries. And I think the use, what the fourth industrial revolution would mean, what are going to be the drivers of growth into the future. I think that's a very interesting question. And finally, recycling and jobs. So I just would like to turn to you ladies and gentlemen, to see anybody would like to react at this point to any of the questions. So shall we start with Regina, please?
I'm just jumping in at the deep end, as it were, because this is none of this directly my field. But I want to address this question about the fourth industrial revolution and about youth. I think it's a very important point you raised there. It's true, the young generation is going to reap what older generation have sown, and the fact that there is at the same time this fourth industrial revolution brings a lot of opportunity. Now, in relation to transportation, for example, to begin with, it brings the opportunity to avoid some transportation which isn't necessary. I mean, transportation is demand-driven, obviously, and there are many, many areas where we need it, where it should be supported and fostered, but you also have crazy stuff. You've got one country exporting and importing the same goods, for example, by transport. So it's not a self-serving thing, and automation and electronic communication in the broader sense can help a lot. So we know of all these advantages, I think. At the same time, I think it's also important for the younger generation to be aware that there are a lot of eggs in one basket with this. And that if we all rely all too very much on automated interaction, the black box phenomenon, and electronic exchanges, storage, communication. You mentioned blockchain, which is in principle promising, but as a lawyer, I'll tell you there are loads and loads of potential issues that need to be satisfactorily addressed before you can actually use this to the maximum sense. So I think it's important to bear in mind that this has also its dangers and its limitations. Again, for the younger generation, which is very much used to doing everything on their iPhones nowadays. Thank you.
And Regina, if you allow, one comment is that there's a lot of anxiety about what a digital economy and automation altogether would mean for jobs. Are machines going to replace a human being in the workforce? And I think the discussions in the International Labour Organization at this moment on the future of work is very much focused on that. But one other point that I'd like to invite you to maybe think about and react to is that it's been noted that the IT industries are also very heavy energy users because of the cooling of the servers, and in some cases they are the largest energy consumers in certain cities. So what does it mean for the green economy? So maybe in the second round I'd like to maybe hear from you as well. But yes, Mr. Selving, please.
Yeah, no, thanks. Let me just try to answer some of these questions. Clearly, on jobs, ILO would know more than we in WTO. But we have been doing some work looking at impacts of technology. And I think you're right, the jobs will be transformed. Technology has a huge impact on what these jobs might be. There's no easy answer apart from the fact that it points towards the need for higher skills, essentially. Higher skills, more routine jobs will disappear. There will be a need to upgrade. And there comes in the challenge, can everyone upgrade? Would it be that easy to make that transition? There are opportunities for doing so. We, at least in the trading system, point towards the opportunities through global value chains, for instance. There is challenges to making that transition. As I said earlier, some of these challenges are not necessarily, in my view, trade protectionism in the sense of a action by another country preventing another country from engaging in trade, but a lot of it has to do with having the ability to trade. Because to trade, you do need to have the quality infrastructure, you do need to have the skills, you need to have the hard infrastructure. You mentioned transportation, for instance. And these requirements keep going up. So there's a lot to be done here as well on the supply side. But countries can also do things themselves. I mean, for instance, if we look at transition, a traditional thing that trade can do is that it can help lower the costs of goods and services. So if there are critical goods and services that are needed for the cost of transition, and they are needed for diversification, you can already do so as a government to look at how you can structure your trade policy. Just as an example, if you look at environmental goods, sometimes for some countries the applied tariffs on things like solar panels could be as high as 10-14% on average, sometimes rising up to 200%. So it's a question, if there is a need to change the type of energy production, whilst at the same time the trade policy is very much preventing that transition, there's a question here of policy coherence. Another traditional role of trade, we talked a bit, I think the person from Brazil talked about small scale. Now, we've had a lot of discussions in WTO about what trade can do for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And I think the interesting thing is that all of those companies that we all know so well today, from Apple, Facebook, or even if you look at China, Alibaba, were all small companies, and they transformed and became huge. How did they do so? They did so actually using trade, a combination of trade, technology, and you mentioned fourth industrial revolution. These were the instruments they used. So there is potential here, I think, to stimulate more investment in key areas for the new climate economy. And it's about, again, looking towards these opportunities. Difficulty, I think, is when going back to the original question from Kamal, is to avoid, if I can say, a green divide, where some societies are very advanced and very able to meet higher sustainability requirements, while others are left behind. We've seen some of these divides occur already in the area of the digital economy or the internet. It's something that has been spoken of, a digital divide. If we're now going from a digital world to a greener world, can we learn from the lessons of the past of not, again, creating yet another divide between those that can meet requirements and those that cannot? Trade does not have an easy solution. We are only one type of policy instrument, but we do need to work coherently with other partners, which is why this sort of platform is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director Lim. I think what you said is also one issue that we've heard in the past few days, that these new industries that were small and grew to be so big that they are now too big to regulate. And there seems to be even a discussion about regulatory vacuum. But I think we'll come back to that. But Dr. Batjargal, to Philipp, any reaction to these comments now?
Okay, and just I want to react two questions. First one, lady, about how to support local business. And of course, government cannot only appeal to do something for green economy and so on, but promote. And recently, just one example, of course, government of Mongolia has very limited capacity to provide some additional finance for small-sized business and so on. And recently, together with GCF, we developed one project to support micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises with very deep engagement of women entrepreneurs. And it was very good project, not only just to make some profit, but also to do something on mitigation, even some aspect of adaptation and so on. It is not only just within the project, but some demonstration part of the project can trigger the business in nearby areas and other sectors and so on. Therefore, we think that government should try to promote the business at the grassroots level. Secondly, about the modern technology, for example, the IT and so on. Very small example. In Mongolia, as you know, we have a very huge area. This is, of course, it's good that we have very big land mass, but on the other hand, it is very difficult to manage it. And if, for example, we want to organize some public gathering and so on, people need to travel by cars, by other means of transport and so on. But modern days, we can use IT and video call, video conference, and so on. Even some sort of distance education, distance health service can be developed, and very without additional GHG emission and without additional harmful business activities and so on. Therefore, even the modern technology can be very useful for all countries, developing countries, which need to solve some problem, combining, as I already said, that modern technology and something from our own experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brother Philipp, would you like to react now or maybe at a later point?
I can. Yeah, just a quick reaction was to actually to the intervention regarding recycling. Actually, we see it similar. So recycling is, in our view, definitely a very important topic that, and we run since many years. I mean, SECO runs since many years projects in different countries where we help to build up actually business models for recycling, and also help the country to set up the institutional setting. Actually, there are also some programs in Ghana as well. But then also another thing, I mean, recycling normally doesn't sound so extremely sexy, because think, okay, the dirty stuff, then you just take it out and then you sell it somewhere else to produce some new goods. But actually, at the end, I have now here a product with me that shows that actually recycling can be extremely sexy. So if you have a look at this bag here, so the material that is reused, I would say probably 95% is recycled, so that's tarp. So some years ago, it was on your streets. And the belt here is at the same time is also recycled, so our car belts or belts from aviation. And yeah, then you just need a good idea, and then you can sell it more or less everywhere, and you can produce it in Switzerland and still can make money out of it. And this means something, because Switzerland is quite expensive, and if you then are able to sell something, means you just need a bright idea. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Sorry,
yeah.
just a light-hearted comment, but this has taken off really big. I mean, this seems to be really hip, this make. So the youngsters, they all walk around with these bags.
Look at me.
Yeah, and yesterday I was at an event and somebody had the same, and they say what's interesting is that if the bag is broken, you bring it back and they fix it. And so that avoids this notion of a circular economy, not just throw away it and buy again, but you go and they fix it. So I think that's very interesting. Rhoda, do you own a bag like that?
I don't. I would really love one. But yes, just to react to, I think the question about the fourth revolution and how youth can play an important role in this, and how can we harness on the opportunities created by through this. I think young people really need to harness on the opportunities. There is definitely the risk of, jobs are going to change. The future of work is going to take a whole different trend. But I think essentially what we need to do is to start researching into what the future is going to be like. And that's one thing that most often we do not invest in. So for me, the most important thing is investments in research, but also in innovation. Because yes, automation is going to be big, it's going to take over jobs, but it doesn't mean that people are going to be completely out of jobs. It just means that jobs are going to be transformed. So for us, it's important for us to invest in innovation, in building skills, because the skills that will be needed will be high technology, and we really need to invest in innovation. But for young people specifically, I think it's important for young people to participate, to be part of the processes. And I can't emphasize on this anymore. Young people have to be at the table. Young people need to be involved in decisions that are taken, in policy-making processes. And that's the only way that we can harness on and maximize this demographic dividend, because all around it's known that Africa, for instance, is a youthful population with over 60% of its population under the youth bracket. And so it's very important for young people to be active in these processes and make the most of the opportunities that would be presented.
Thank you, Rhoda. I think what you say about young people is also seen in politics. We look at the political landscape, we see now political leadership, a generational change. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to get back at this point, any comment, any reaction, what the digital economy, the fourth industrial revolution would mean for jobs, what could be done more on small business development, the recycling industry, some of the questions that have come. Any further questions or comment? All right, so Madame there, and then the gentleman over there, and then sir, I come back to you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sara Gräslund from the Swedish Development Agency. Really, really interesting and very constructive, all your experiences and knowledge that you share. And I wanted to ask for some reflections about this with the potential green divide, and on the other hand, the need for regulation and standards, and if you see that as something that could create a green divide, and how can we think about balancing that in a constructive way? So, thank you.
Thank you.
Detlef Müller-Mahn, University of Bonn. Mr. Batjargal made a distinction in the beginning between green growth, green development, and green economy, and we didn't talk about the distinction yet. My question would be, does the green economy need growth, or rather degrowth, with these recyclable bags that Mr. Ischer showed?
Thank you. A very, very interesting question. So do you want to react further, please?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Maybe just to briefly also clarify about the tech companies, and Mr. Kamal Gui, you mentioned the server farms, and this is very true. They consume a lot of energy, but I think tech companies can in two ways contribute, and are already contributing to more green economy, or at least make commitments. So the server farms, they have to consume a lot of energy, but both Alphabet, so Google, and Apple made commitments to be totally on renewables by, I think, 2030. And Apple also, in summer, they launched a $1.5 billion green bond to get up their energy efficiency. And also when we consider the Paris Agreement, there was a letter sent to the US president not to step out of the Paris Agreement. This was signed by, as far as I know, 5 or 6 tech companies. So we have public commitment from their side, and we also have services which they provide, which can be helpful. So for example, the blockchain technology, which we discussed at actually the WTO Public Forum, the Trade and Environment, division's event, there was a speaker from the World Economic Forum who mentioned that blockchain could be used to make the carbon trading system more efficient, more clean. So this is one service provided by the fourth industrial revolution and then used in green economy. Or we could also just look at Tesla, for example, which I assume is also making a big contribution. So this, I think, are 2 points. On the one hand, we have commitment from these companies through issuing green bonds, for example. On the other hand, we have services they provide. And the link is maybe also that these companies are also young. Like, I think most of these companies are even younger than I am, Google, Tesla, etc. And they are also therefore very attractive for young people. So I don't know how it was 40, 50 years ago, but nowadays if you would go in a business school or in an engineering school and you would ask people where you want to work, it would be Facebook, Google, and these companies rather than a fossil fuel company, for example.
Well, thank you so much for this compliment. So I just would like to come back to the panel. I think one very interesting question is what regulatory frameworks could help avoid the green divide, and what the green economy means also economic growth, or are we talking about degrowth? So I just turn it back to you, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, Dr. Mr. Linford. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sort of trying to think through this question of green divide, and maybe this can be one way to illustrate it. I mean, in our context, you know, in the trade context or WTO type context, we see a lot of instances where product standards are simply not aligned. You know, take for instance energy efficiency standards. Okay. You have an objective. The regulatory objective may be more energy efficiency. That is accepted. But in terms of the actual implementation, you will see many different labels. You will see many different types of energy efficiency standards. You will see different criteria, possibly different conformity assessment procedures. And I don't have the slide here, but if I were to show you globally all of the different types of labels and standards and ways to show conformity, it is quite bewildering for the consumer, much less for the producer. So one way to deal with this, and this is actually already contained within the WTO agreement, which concerns this type of area, is to try to get regulators to at least regulate on the basis of a relevant international standard. Move towards more international standards. It's difficult, it's not easy, it's not the sort of work that we do. There are international standardization bodies who do this sort of work. And there are also challenges because there's a question of what is the right or relevant international standard, you know. So these are sort of questions. I don't have an answer, but in principle, it's about better alignment, more coordination, more harmonization. But then you've got a question of choice. Harmonize to what level, to what standard? And that comes back to your original question again about green protectionism. This is the concern that is out there. Are we harmonizing towards a relevant standard? Or is that standard one that is helping some producers more than other producers? And these sorts of questions are there. Thanks.
Thank you, but I was thinking as you were speaking of the need for harmonizing these standards at the international level. But one trend that is observed around the world is the growth of regional and bilateral trade agreements. So would you see this trend as a complication or as a facilitation of the need to have common technical standards to facilitate green trade? Like the Africa-EU agreements, it is a trend, the transatlantic trade agreements. So they are going more regional and bilateral at a fast speed. But just to maybe reflect on that. But there were also these questions on the growth and degrowth. I don't know if any of our panelists, or anybody would like to react to that. And I think we... Yes, Doctor?
about difference between green development and green economy. We think that we have to start not from economy, but from lifestyle. We have to have green lifestyle. For what economy? Economy is just serving to provide what human needs. If people will manage with their needs, greening their necessity, the economy, I think would be green. For today, for example, in many four countries, every resident is struggling to have additional calorie in food items. While in other countries, others struggling, people to reduce by 1 calorie. It means in some countries, people are spending money to eat something more than necessary. Then again, they need to spend money to reduce obesity and so on. And it means if we will have green lifestyle, everything should be. Otherwise, just talk about green economy. It is not so maybe very close to solution. Thank you.
Well, so green growth, does green economy necessarily lead to green growth? I think this is actually an interesting debate that we need more time for, and the whole concept of degrowth. I think that the call for us to green our economies indirectly talks about a general need for a system change, because we understand that the current system is not working in our favor and we need a complete system change. But whether this essentially leads to, this can be described as degrowth, that's something that we need more time to debate on. But I think this actually calls for us to rethink the current indicators for development, because that is essentially the issue. If we talk about developments, what indicators are we looking at? And as Professor describes, would you describe well-being, or would you use well-being as an indicator of development? So these are some of the issues that I think we need to think about holistically in the debate on green economy, and somehow these haven't really been clearly defined. But it's really, it's interesting discussions, but then I think it needs more time. And thank you very much, Prof, for bringing it up. But it may be interesting for us to, yes, find some space to discuss and think through the whole concept of degrowth and whether green economy necessarily leads to green growth, and whether that's what we are essentially fighting for and that's what we want. So, interesting views, but then more time to debate on that, in my opinion.
I see Madame there. Did you want to react to this point? Yes, there. Yes,
Alina Herrmann from Heidelberg University. So, yeah, my question would also be, because I've been on many sessions, especially the ones from the NGOs, where this topic of changing the system was basically seen as the solution, whereas on other times maybe just greening the economy is seen as a solution. And I would especially like to ask Mr. Lim from the WTO how this is seen in your organization, because so is there any even discussion about system change? Or, I mean, probably, I would imagine not so much, but maybe that's different.
Well, that's a very important question. So let's just take two more questions. I see Madame here and the gentleman there, and then the fourth question, and we come back to our panelists.
Thank you very much. My name is Hawa Mustafa. I work with the Nigeria Labour Congress. I'm part of the ITUC delegation. I found the discussion on green economy and linked to development, very interesting. And that's the point that I wish to chip in my comment. I think the business of looking at green economy is more like we have focused more on the business aspect of it, the profit and the gains, rather than the benefit, particularly to the ordinary or the vulnerable sectors of the economy or of the society. But that when we transform it, or when we use a bigger lens, which is the focus on development, I think it makes it broader and it makes it more inclusive of the economy and even the social system that drives the economy, and of course the politics that also drives the policy that defines the economy or moves the economy. It becomes more holistic and it becomes more impactful. But now this is where I also link up to the WTO, just in line with the previous question. The WTO seems to, in its rules and regulations, seems to focus more on the benefits, the profits, the business of trade, even when it links it to the environment. Now, when we say we want to go beyond that, is the WTO beginning to think of, because it's going to also probably harm even the very essence, it's going to question, the very essence of the WTO's existence, which is that, are you ready? Is the WTO ready to go beyond trade and environment, to look at environment within the context of climate change? Because if you look at it as trade and environment, I think it's narrowed, it's narrowed to the aspect of how does environment enhance the business of trade, so to say. But when you look at it beyond the environment to say trade, or look at environment within the context of the climate change, and then look at it therefore, how does it impact either positively or negatively on the issues of trade, and therefore translate that to the rules and regulations of the WTO. I just want to know, is the WTO looking at it from that aspect? If not now, maybe is it something that can be possible for the WTO to look at and still retain its identity or its philosophy as the WTO? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting question. I think really fundamental issues you were raising. But I just, sir, over there and the two, and then Mr. Contius, and then we come back to our panel.
My name is Uriba First Samba Mugera from Uganda. I'm chief planner for the country. From a planning perspective, we see green growth as a vehicle in implementing sustainable development goals, taking into account socially inclusive and environmentally sustained. So I've heard of green growth, decent jobs, and at such. We hope that we can still create jobs, we can industrialize, but bearing in mind that it is socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm going to get from Brazil, from representative of ECOSOC. I'm getting her link. She said about politics. But I think one of the main problems here is like we human race, because we always want more. We are greed of something. For example, if you get those new cell phones, they only last for a year or 2 years. And if you get those older ones, they last for 7, 8 years. So that's the main thing. Why they don't put like the new cell phones with that durability, not being disposable, and so they're gonna last more, and people won't need to change every once in a year, a cell phone, the TV, cars, everything. So it's not about politics, it's about human greed, and that's it.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Contius, did you want to react now?
I think it's a great discussion because it makes visible that our daily decisions in our own lives matter quite a bit, exactly as you just mentioned, the smartphones. But I think the other issue is growth really respecting the environment and social affairs, etc. I think this question is more or less now politically, multilaterally decided. Let's not forget that. Whatever the answers will be now from the panel, it is decided together with all governments and interested stakeholders had commented on this, that what we do has to be a sustainable growth which is inclusive and which is respecting planetary boundaries. So there's no way around that. And what we are discussing here is how to come to grips with it. But the old struggle, which is still the struggle in many discussions here at the conference, and also, for instance, when the German government is now discussing who will form the next coalition, and the parties are discussing it. I mean, all these issues come up. But as a world community, we have decided the basic, what is the basic of all this, which is respecting planetary boundaries and to be by far more inclusive than we were. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for reminding us. And I think that is what the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is about: economic growth, environmental sustainability, and social inclusion. And I think that's a very important guiding and political framework. But we had very fundamental questions about, are we talking of a system change or of just greening the economies? And is the trade system going to be a tool for environmental sustainability, if I can reframe that question, or for a way to expand business and trade? So I just cannot answer these questions, and I would just put them over to you. So Regina, did you want to go first, please?
I'd love to. I have things to say on everything, but I won't, of course.
And Regina, if you allow me, I think with the time we have remaining, I would just invite panelists to also take the opportunity to make your closing statements in responding to these questions.
Very quickly on this. This is a very interesting discussion, and a lot of things have already been said. There is a divide. There always will be. There always has been. And whatever we say, the world is much less equal than it ought to be, given all the commitments over decades. I mean, that's just a fact. And it's a constant struggle not to have a divide in whatever area, etc. At the same time, what our colleague from Germany said is very, very valid. The SDG, the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, is a commitment by the international community, entered into force, proper agreement, and so on. And one has to hold policymakers to what they have agreed. So it's the one thing maybe what the world is or what it's like, and another thing is what commitments have been declared, and that has to be aligned. But in terms of regulation, because this is another thing that has come up, and I just like to say something on this, not on WTO rules or regulation. I'm sure you will be addressing these. But just generally speaking, what we mustn't forget is rules and regulations, they have a purpose. And the purpose is to implement some kind of policy objectives, some kind of agreed objectives. And to that end, they're very, very important to achieve this. And then enforcement plays an important role, again, to bring this, to see this through. So in the context of climate change, for instance, it's very important also that we, and in greening economies more generally, it's very important that we start thinking about how we can use regulation and standards effectively to achieve these objectives. And just on the Paris Agreement, maybe I could mention this. There was a side event yesterday by an initiative led by UNEP, Commonwealth Secretariat, and UNFCCC Secretariat, to which we're contributing, which is geared towards the development of a climate change and law toolkit to help governments across the world implementing the Paris Agreement. And another example is, for instance, on the side of adaptation, which I mentioned we've been working on. Very interesting development in the European Union. There are amendments to the to the Environmental Impacts Assessment Directive, which requires environmental impact assessments for every large project. And that now, for the first time, entered into force this year, also requires to take into consideration the impacts of climate change. So not just the environmental impacts of a project, but also the impacts of the environment and of the climate on the project. So this is, I think the direction is important, and that's going to be used. I don't know what you want, in terms of closing statements. I would like to just highlight here something about our work on SIDS, but I think it's more important that everybody gets a shot at the questions and for the discussion that has just developed. So we'll see how we're doing with time. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina.
Thanks very much. No, I think all of these questions are clearly very pertinent and very important, and I probably will not be able to answer all of them, but I think to start with, it's probably important to recognize that if you look at the WTO agreement, the founding agreement of WTO, and you look at the paragraph 1 of that agreement, it sets out very clearly that the trade as a tool is an enabler. It's not set out that it's trade for trade's gain per se, and is an enabler to what? I mean, the three things that are spelled out is basically raising standards of living, generating employment, and basically leading towards greater sustainable development. And the word sustainable development is actually there. It's actually within the very founding objectives of the organization. And at the same time, it also spells out quite clearly that it should do so respecting what Mr. Contius said already, the limits of the environment and protecting the environment. So it is actually there. So it's not as though it's something new that needs to come to the system. It's actually part of the system. And it's also why you find that in the SDGs 2030, you have the same framework of trade as an enabler to obtain things within the SDGs, be it on health, environment, on jobs, etc. So I think that's very much framed. The other question is it being achieved, and how is it being achieved? Here, I think it's important to recognize that the WTO, like all international organizations, is not a unitary actor. It is made up of member states, member nations. How those members seek to pursue their objectives, be it at UNFCCC or at WTO, it's in the same situation. They pursue their policies as they see fit and their positions as they see fit. That being said, the system clearly has evolved. I mean, it has evolved since the time I joined it, and I joined the WTO quite some time ago. It's nearly like 19 years or so ago. And the system has evolved, but it evolves incrementally, and it evolves through member states. Member states are the ones who bring proposals, who discuss, who decide. Now, if they see a need to go further in one particular direction or another, they need to build consensus. It's the same thing that you have in UNFCCC, more or less. So you have the same sort of dynamics, the debate. And what is trade at the end of the day? Trade is a reflection of society. I mean, society will have to decide what it seeks its political masters to do, and those political masters will have to instruct its delegations in terms of how they should operate within these organizations. And here there is clearly a challenge, and I'll be very frank, is that WTO is not a world government. WTO is constituted to work on the areas of trade. Coherence needs to be brought up nationally. National delegations have to speak to each other. If environment is a very strong and important policy priority, which I believe it is, that message has to go to the trade delegation that comes to the WTO. It will not come top down. It will not come from the organization top down. It has to be bottom up from the national positions themselves. But then, to be on a more positive note, since it's closing remarks as well, you may have heard or may not have heard of certain areas where trade can be very effective. I mean, currently we're having a negotiation on eliminating fishery subsidies that lead to illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. It's not climate change per se, but it's fishing. And here it's both a trade question, it's also an environmental question. Subsidies that lead towards overcapacity, overfishing, distorts trade in fish. And At the same time, this distortions of trade in fish leads down to an unsustainable level of fish stocks. This area, WTO could do something if the negotiators actually reach to a point of eliminating these subsidies, which are required anyway by SDG 14.6, and that's what they're working on. Another area that the negotiators tried but have not yet succeeded is eliminating and reducing tariffs on environmental goods, which include all the goods that you need for renewable energy generation. Think about how far renewable energy prices have come down today. That would not have happened if you had not had trade. It's basically trade that has been driving down prices to the point where they're nearly on par with fossil fuel. So I think you have to look at the trading system to find opportunities based on the tools that the trading system can provide. The trading system will not answer everything. And these tools can be quite effective if framed correctly. So thanks.
Well, thank you so much. So I just turn to our other panelists for your closing remarks. So we have almost finished our time now, but may I go to Philipp first, please?
Yes, I will do short. I mean, although green economy is rather a new term, I mean, it does not mean that we have to reinvent the wheel in all areas. I mean, also green economy means quite often in the first place that we actually have to implement good economic politics. That means also that we have to look at something like internalization of negative externalities. It can be via pricing mechanisms and so on. And just one last remark to technology. Although I'm absolutely convinced that new technology will play an important role that help us to green our economy, they will not become effective unless we have the institutional setting that help them to implement. This is especially true for example, just the example that has been made for mitigation scenarios for trading schemes. So if we do not find here a solution, then also blockchain will play no role.
Thank you very much, Philipp. Rhoda, would you make closing remarks?
So just quickly, I think that for us, what's important is we do agree that we need to respect, to promote economic growth whilst respecting planetary boundaries. But then for us, what is most important is to focus on the social dimension of greening our economies. And questions around standards and whether we need regulatory frameworks, I think is also something that calls for debate. But then for me, I think what's most important is to look at whether the existing frameworks and multilateral institutions are actually, whether the frameworks existing are actually working in our favor. And so that is something that we need to consider. For me, I feel that what is most important, or the work that needs to be done, is at national level, and so much not standards and regulatory frameworks. And for us as trade unions, this is why we are advocating that at national level, our national development plans should integrate the questions around just transition, as well as the social dimension of building sustainable economies. And this should be done in a very inclusive way, bringing together different stakeholders as well as various constituencies. And I think this is what PAGE is doing already in most of our countries. And so this is a good example, and we really do appreciate PAGE for this and encourage them to continue this and extend it possibly to other countries, especially in the South.
Thank you very much, Dr. Batjargal. Any closing words, if any? But I think the conversation is not over. We are still here. I just would like, on behalf of PAGE, the WTO and UNCTAD, and our PAGE funding partners, to thank you so much for having spent time with us. Just a round of applause with our panel and opening remarks. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. We have a good afternoon. Thank you.